So on behalf of the Paper Manufacturers Association of South Africa, the Sustainable African Forest Assurance Scheme, and the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, I welcome you to an introduction on carbon reporting and carbon tax for the forestry and forest products sector. If you don't know me, my name is Samantha Charles, and the purpose of this webinar is to present an overview of some legislative framework around reporting carbon emissions and accounting for carbon tax. I am not the expert here, so that's why we have a panel of speakers today. We have Ms. Jane Maloney, Executive Director of the Paper Manufacturers Association, otherwise known as PAMSA. We have from the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, Ms. Sewela Malaka, Control Environment Officer in the Chief Director for Climate Change Mitigation and Specialist Monitoring Service, and the Directorate of GHG Inventory and Systems. We've got Ms. Julie Borland. Many of you know her, PAMS's Research and Development Coordinator, working closely with SAFAS. And then we have Dr. David Everard, who is a consultant to SAFAS and is well known for a lot of his work in sustainable land use. Just from a housekeeping perspective, I've often said I don't need to tell you where your bathrooms are. That's great with webinars, but please use the chat functionality for your questions, and where possible, our panelists will answer them during the chat. The session will be recorded and we will make it available to you if you need to log off or if you know of people who are not able to attend. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Jane and she will give us a brief introduction.
Good morning, everybody. It's wonderful to see so many of you, and I can't even say that you're out and about on a freezing cold day. It's definitely cold in KZN. So we are excited as PAMSA to be able to chat about these legislative frameworks, and we're even more excited about the fact that we have been involved in facilitating an interaction between the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment and the Sustainable African, how does it go? SAFAS, it's much easier. And that we've been involved in this pilot. So we are looking forward to this discussion. We're going to have a very, very high level overview. It's an incredibly complex area, and I don't presume to understand it at all. So I am not one of those experts that Samantha spoke about. Today will be like putting your toe in the water and feeling that it's freezing cold. And we hope that by the end of this session that you'll be willing to dive in and truly get involved. We may have some polls at the end of the session. And what we're really wanting to know is what additional webinars we're going to need to have in order to share the knowledge and to ensure that our entire value chain is compliant. The difference between needing to report as a grower and needing to account for your carbon and pay a carbon tax as a producer will be one of the things that you will learn about. What we really, really also hoping is that by the end of it, the complexity will have become simpler. So without further ado, I shall hand back to Samantha, who will introduce our first speaker.
Thank you, Jane. Yes, I've got a poll running now around how do you rate your knowledge on carbon sequestration and storage in plantations. Interestingly, it's scoring largely on the lower end. So just a note to our speakers, not everybody knows what's happening, but as Jane said, it's a dipping our toes in the water and just really a high level overview. With that, I'd like to introduce Sewela Malaka, and she will take us through the legal framework overview and some of the tools and systems involved. Thank you, Sewela. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As Samantha already introduced me, I'm Sewela Malaka from the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment. And today I'll be presenting on the South African National Greenhouse Gas Emissions Reporting Regulations, as well as the SAGAS and MRV2 So from the department, this will be the presentation that we'll render, and I'm not alone. I'm with my director, Cindy Siwe Mashele. She's here. And without any waste of time, I'll just start presenting. This is the... Okay, this is the outline of my presentation. For today's talk, I'll give the overview of the greenhouse gas emissions reporting regulations. I will also talk on the SEJAS on how to create an account registration process. And also I'll talk on how to register a new data provider on SEJAS. I will also touch base on the SEJAS reporting module. And lastly, I'll talk on the MRV tool. So with our regulations, the purpose of these regulations is just to introduce a single national reporting system for the transparent reporting of greenhouse gas emissions, which will be used firstly to update and maintain a national greenhouse gas inventory. And secondly, it will be for the Republic of South Africa to meet its reporting obligations under the United Framework Convention on Climate Change. And also, lastly, to inform the formulation and implementation of the legislation and policy. So these regulations were established to address challenges in the data collection process. Okay. So in 2017, the minister established a national reporting framework by publishing the National Greenhouse Gas Reporting Regulations under the National Environmental Management Air Quality Act. So the purpose of these regulations was to introduce a single national reporting system, as I've already highlighted, for reporting. And these regulations enables us as a country to meet our obligations under the UNFCCC, which we ratified as a country in 1997. And the amendments regulations were also published on the 11th September 2020. So with regard to the application of the regulations, these reporting regulations apply to the categories of emission sources listed in Annexure 1 to the regulations that I have mentioned, and a corresponding data provider is classified in Regulation 4 of these regulations. So those activities include activities from 4 sectors, which is energy sector, industrial processes and product use, AFOLU, and waste sector, as I've highlighted on this slide. This is just to show the structure of our regulations. For example, all the legal concepts in the regulations are well defined, and the purpose of these regulations is also well defined. So the reporting requirements and reporting boundaries are also as well explained in the regulations. Within the regulations, there are 5 annexures, and the first annexure is a list of activities for which emissions must be reported to the competent authority. And the second annexure is the registration template, the template that data providers use to register their companies. And the third one is the annual reporting template. This is the template that data providers use to complete their reports and submit to the department. And we also have an annexure, which is the one that populate information or the company submissions in terms of Regulation 10, Section 2. And lastly, we have the annexure 5, which is the standby generator template. This one helps with the registration of standby generators. In terms of the reporting requirements, based on the Regulation 7, Section 1, It entails that a data provider must submit IPCC emission sources and related greenhouse gas emissions and activity data as specified in Annexure 1 of the regulations. So for all of these relevant greenhouse gases, and for each of its facilities and its accordance with the data and format requirements specified in Annexure 3 to the regulations. So for the preceding calendar year, to compute, the data provider have to report their emissions for the preceding calendar year to the department by the 31st March of each year. So where the 31st falls on a Saturday, Sunday, or a public holiday, the submission deadline is the next working day. So in terms of determining the reporting boundaries of the organization or of the data provider, so the organization reports on all activities which it has operational control. So the operational control is not based on the financial control boundary and also not based on the equity share boundary. So therefore, the financial control boundary and equity share boundary are not applicable under the GHG reporting regulations, and the operational control boundary is applicable under the regulations. Just to highlight on the key guiding documents that support reporting program in responding to who should report and what need to be reported, the reporting regulations are there in place to inform on that. So the how part or the methodologies to be used in reporting, we have the reporting guidelines, the methodological guidelines for quantification of greenhouse gas emissions. And we also have the carbon sequestration guidelines for forestry industry. We also have in place the verification guidelines to assist in validating and verifying the data submitted to say, is it accurate, is it complete, and etc. So these guidelines defines the principles that will trigger verification or inspection of the greenhouse gas reports. For all these guidelines, they do assist us in making sure that the greenhouse gas emissions reports do follow the greenhouse gas accounting and reporting principles. So the reports should be transparent, accurate, complete, consistent, comparable, and rational. Okay, now I will take you through the SAGAS system on how to create an account. So in order to access the SAGAS public portal web application, public users can either enter from the link on the South African SAGAS landing page or open any internet browser application and directly enter the website. So the link will take you to the SAGAS landing page as shown on the slide. And on SAGAS landing page, you will be able to see that we have two public portals. So the first one is the SAGAS public portal user training site. And we also have SAGAS public portal user official production site. So after clicking on the login tab, it will take you on the login page, wherein you'll be able to click on register account. After clicking on the register account, it will give you or open to a form wherein step number 1, you have to populate in the basic information. So you have to populate the necessary basic information, such as your personal information, mailing address. And step number 2 is the account type. After inputting or populating all the required basic information, the public users are able to click on next button to continue to select the desired account type. So the public user account can only be associated with one account type. So the provided account types includes the ACO. This one is the accountant officer, is responsible for submitting submittals. ACO can also assign consultants to help prepare reports for each facility assigned to them. And we also have the ECO, which is the consultant. The consultant can only prepare submittals and not submit them. And we have other as the account type. This one is granted access to submit, for example, request approval for country-specific emission factor forms. For this account type, even though it's not associated with any data provider, they are able to submit the request of approval for country-specific emission factors. So one thing to note, which is critical, is if the wrong account type is chosen, the public user will not be able to prepare and submit the submittal. Like, for example, if instead of selecting the ACO, you select the other, you are not going to be able to prepare the submittals and submit them. So instead, the public user will need to deregister the account before registering with the correct account type. So in case maybe you are facing challenges, we are available. You can send your query on GAG reporting, seeking for assistance, and we'll assist you in deregistering and creating the correct account type. And then step number 3 is the security questions. After picking up the account type or selecting the account type, you are required to create answers to 5 selected security questions. The answer will be used as an identity verification purpose after public users log in their accounts to conduct certain actions, such as to submit annual greenhouse gas emission report. So these security questions, the answers that you select or create, one of the 5 questions will pop out whenever you're trying to submit any application on SEJAS. And step number 4, which is the final review. The user is able to review the information supplied after populating the information. And if there's any error or anything that need to be revised, the user is able to click on previous button to go back to the page and revise the information. And you have to tick on I'm not a robot, so that once all the information is confirmed, then the public user, after checking the I'm not robot, they will be able to register and create their account. And then you will, the system will automatically send a registration successful message. And if it's only gonna send that successful registration message only if you are you successfully have created your account. The user is able to click on back to the login page, and this time you have already created your account. You now have the login credentials. You then populate your username together with the password that you just created, and you are able to log into the SEJAS system. And for the first time login users, you have to always remember your username and password so that you'll be able to log in on SEJAS. And after logging in, this is what you will see on SEJAS dashboard. And on SEJAS dashboard, you are able to create new submittal. You are also able to edit unfinished submittals and also to monitor the submittal status. And we have under obligation, this section shows if you have an outstanding submission that you must make, or maybe under the sendbacks, you have any submittal that was sent back by the department for a revision, it will show under the sendback. And you are also able to see the list of submissions that are pending and the ones that are already submitted on your side. And under the new submittals, you are able to initiate several applications. For example, deregistration application, modification application. You are also able to register a new data provider, and you are also able to request approval for country-specific emission factor and submit it. So under my account tab, you are able to update personal information. You are able to edit your basic information, and you are also able to change your password or your PIN number, which is associated with your account. And you are also able to select the submittal groups. For instance, if you are responsible for GAG reporting for that particular company, you have to click on the GAG reporting group. And if you are also responsible for carbon budget, you have to also select the carbon budget group. And you are also able to update your security questions answers. And under consultants tab, you are also able to associate, as an ACO, you are able to associate consultants with your data provider and assign them to a specific facility. And under the data provider tab, you are also able to see the list of data providers that are linked or associated to that particular account type. Okay, now I will quickly move to the process on how to register a new data provider. So based on the amendments to the National Greenhouse Gas Emissions Reporting Regulations 2016, which have been published for implementation, there are additional activities which are applicable for reporting, and these activities are under forestry industry. This includes activities such as forest land, remaining forest land, land converted to forest land, biomass burning in forest lands, direct and indirect nitrous oxide emissions from managed soils, as well as harvested wood products. The threshold on the forest land, remaining forest land management practices is 100 hectares. And this means that the data provider owning equal or greater than 100 hectares of plantations have to report. So in order to register a new data provider on your dashboard, the step number one that you need to do is to select or click on the Register New Data Provider tab from the right navigation pane. After clicking on the New Data Provider, Register New Data Provider, and then it will open up to a form wherein under Data Provider Information form, you have to provide a data provider information wherein you are required to input the necessary data for the data provider. So you are also required to select on create new data provider. Since the data provider is not existing on SAGES, it's a new data provider that you are trying to register and submit the application. So still under the data provider information, you have to provide the contact person details. For example, if is the ACO, the data provider, the ACO can be, under the contact person, you can either provide the ACO data or the owner of the company or any responsible official that the department will be able to engage with regarding the submissions on SAGES. And the second step in creating or registering the data provider on SAGES is addition of facility and activity. Under Facility Association tab, the public users are required to input facility and activity information associated with this data provider. And the activity information public users need to be selected to select all applicable IPCC codes as shown on the slides. So you have to select all the activities that are practiced, for example, in the forest or plantations that you have. You have to make sure that you select the correct applicable IPCC codes for each facility or plantation. And we also have the attachment tab, wherein as the user, you are able to upload any supporting documents in the attachments tab, which maybe you believe that it will be helpful for the department to review and approve your application or submission. On the review tab, you are able to check if all the required fields are fully completed. And the Ready X sign implies there is a missing information on the corresponding form, and you have to click on the PDF icon. So the public users are also able to print out the hard copy of the completed online form. So if there is the Ready X as shown on the slide that I'm sharing, you have to then go back and correct the information or provide more information that is missing. Then lastly, you are able to submit by clicking on the submit button on the submission tab. You'll be able to submit. So the submitter needs to complete the following actions. Complete the certification sections, and also provide a correct answer to all 5 security questions that will pop out. So as the security questions are used as a verification of the identity of whoever is trying to submit. Also remember to input the correct PIN number from your email that you have received upon the confirmation of your ACO account registration. Then you'll be able to submit. So after submitting, we have the review flow, wherein we have a few steps that we undertake at the authority level. So after submitting your registration, the system coordinator will then nominate a technical expert reviewer who will then review your submission. And after doing the initial review, they will determine if the required the submission is recommended for approval or it's required for a revision. So if your application is recommended for a revision, it will then be sent back to you so that you are able to address the comments and provide the necessary information that is missing. Then you will resubmit your application again for the second time after revising. So even after revising your registration, when you resubmit for the second time, we'll repeat the very same review flow, wherein the nominated technical expert review will do the initial review and recommend whether it's approved or it still need to be revised. If the registration is fine, all the information is provided, then it will be recommended for approval, and then it will go to step 3, wherein the final recommendation are done and final decision is taken. And lastly, there will be issuance of acceptance letter. This is just to confirm that your registration is fine. So the SEJAS reporting module. Okay, given the example of forest land remaining forest land, firstly, you have to add the item and the activity details. So to report activity amount and emission data, public users need to click on Add Item button on the IPCC code tab. And after clicking on the IPCC code tab, wherein, for example, on the screenshot I've shown you, you select the 3B1A, which is the forest land remaining forest land. After selecting the correct activity, the next step, you have to select the tier method that you have used. And the tier 1 methodology, that's when you are using IPCC default emission factors. And tier 2, that's when, for in case the country-specific emission factors are available or the sector-specific parameters are available. So you are able to select the tier 2 methodology. And the tier 3, that's where the calculation methodology is based exclusively on facility level parameter. Or maybe if you are doing continuous monitoring, then you'll be able to select tier 3. For example, if maybe you are using software or detailed mass balance, any model that you'll be using to estimate your emissions, then you have to select tier 3. And after estimating your emissions, you then have to add the annual emissions in tons, as I've shown on the screen. Then lastly, you have to attach the supporting documents for greenhouse gas emission calculations. That will be the calculation files showing all the algorithms that you have used. Then in this case, for forestry industry activities, you are going to use the MRV tool. And after populating your information on the MRV tool, you then attach that copy of the MRV tool consisting the data from all the plantations. Thereafter, you will review and submit. Okay, the MRV tool that I spoke about, this is just a Microsoft Excel file which aims to collect information on emissions and removals from companies that are subject to reporting or accounting obligations. So this MRV tool is the estimation and accounting tool for forest plantation and timber processing industry. The emission or removal estimates method implemented in the MRV tool are explained well and in details in the methodological guidelines. So the MRV tool contains of various sheets with different purposes. For example, we have the facility register. It contains the main plantation details to be filled or completed by the user. And again, we have the parameters sheet. It has the default 2006 IPCC guidance and country-specific parameters that are provided to support the estimates that you'll be doing. And we also have the supporting calculations sheet. This sheet consists of the defaults wherein they are provided where available, but if alternative data is available, which is more representative for the company circumstances, that can also be used. So the MRV tool allows the reporting or accounting of the emissions or removal estimates. So it is recommended, or the department recommend that users familiarize themselves with the methodological guidelines, which is the carbon sequestration guidelines, before using the MRV tool. So detailed information is provided within each sheet, as I've highlighted, as is within the methodological guidelines. And you have to complete all the green cells, that's your input data cells, which are relevant for the tier that is being applied. One critical thing that you need to also note is the MRV tool use either the gain loss or the stock difference method for calculating the carbon stock change in living biomass. So in this case, you will be able to choose whether you want to use the gain loss or the stock difference. And again, it uses either the tier 1 or tier 2 tables provided for sawmills in the harvested wood product sheet. So you have to complete the methodology boxes at the top of each sheet, and you have to add new rows under the tables as needed. So the MRV tool is not limiting. You have to add rows just to include all the plantation species that you have in your compartments, and the formula will be copied automatically. So some tables are pre-filled with data for demonstration purposes, and references are provided to the methodological guidelines, and this data should be overridden or removed before submitting the file. So you have to remove those examples before you can submit your report. And the default parameters are provided for some categories, and users may use their own parameters as long as justification is provided. So detailed information is provided within the methodology. So if you use your own parameters, you have to attach the supporting documents to say or confirm where you got the parameters. So some activity data estimates required for the yellow compilation sheets can be generated in the sheet supporting calculations in the MRV tool, and the sheet reporting and accounting in the MRV tool is filled automatically when you populate your inputs. And ensure that the appropriate methods are selected in the drop downs. Where no emissions or removals are generated from the source or the pool, the appropriate notation keys should be applied. So for today, I'll just stop here. Thanks.
Thank you, Sawela. A lot of information, I think, for many of those on the call. But as we've said before, this is very much of a high-level introduction, and we will be drilling down in future webinars to go into detail. And I'm sure there will be some training available on how to use the system, the what's and the wherefores and the hows. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Julie Borland, who will also cover some of the carbon reporting and accounting limitations and other aspects around third-party timber. Over to you, Julie.
I'd just like to give a summary and an overview on the concepts of reporting and accounting. Sawela has given us a really good overview on the regulatory framework around emissions reporting. And sequestration came to the fore once we had carbon tax introduced. Before that, we hadn't really considered how to measure and report sequestration at a company level. So work started at that point, and Sawela has gone through some of the documents, but just to give a little bit more information about that. Starting back at the carbon cycle, I'm sure you all recognize this. It shows you where we have carbon storage, where we have carbon sequestration, the positive aspects of where carbon is sequestrated and stored within the products, but it also demonstrates that we have emissions that we have to report on. So we're responsible for emissions from our processing plants. We're responsible for emissions from our products that find their way into landfill sites. And we also know that poorly managed plantations are susceptible also to emissions. And plantations are required also to declare emissions that are as a result of their management, such as fertilizer use and diesel consumption, but there'll be a lot more detail about this in the next presentation. But this shows that we have to report both the carbon that we are taking out of the atmosphere and this carbon that we're putting back into the atmosphere. So what are our legal responsibilities? Suella touched on the framework. Reporting, both on mills and plantations are required to report to the SAGES system. The mills have been reporting emissions for quite some time using the methodology that has been gazetted by the department. And you will all recognize the thresholds around that in terms of fuel combustion activities and wastewater treatment. The new development is around the sequestration of carbon into the harvested wood products that are produced from each of the mills. And mills, pulp and paper, and also sawmills, the same applies to those. And as Suella said, now plantations equal or greater than 100 hectares are also required to register and report on emissions. So reporting, I think everyone's very used to that. Accounting became a feature with the introduction of the carbon tax in 2019. The carbon taxpayer is at the moment is the mill. So it is only the mill that's required to report or account for their emissions to the National Treasury and pay the carbon tax on an annual basis. And at the present time, it's the thresholds are also around the same as the reporting thresholds, but the one criterion around timber is that only first-party timber is currently recognized. So I think at the moment, plantations, it's mainly the larger companies that are reporting and not too many of the smaller or medium-sized plantations that are registered and reporting on an annual basis yet. So these look quite frightening, but I think the key points are that with the introduction of carbon tax, after much negotiation with National Treasury, the significance of sequestration was accepted and was the factor of S, which you can see in the carbon tax calculation, was allowed to be included into carbon tax calculations. So we were allowed, therefore, to deduct from the emissions at the mill the carbon that was sequestered in the plantation and in harvested wood products. So this is in line with the carbon tax. The intention of the carbon tax was used for the mitigation of emissions. So it's for that reason that the recognition was given. And as Suella mentioned, there's a very comprehensive guiding document that gives a
overview of all the assumptions, the principles, the working solutions, the default values, everything that you would need to find around information that would be required to calculate that carbon tax formula is included in there. So the methodology makes also that gives the background and gives information on how you actually calculate the S factor in the sequestration calculations. And it takes into account both the carbon that's stored in the harvested wood products and the additional carbon stored in the plantation over an annual period of time. And you can see that provision is made for emissions from fire and emissions from fertilizer. But at the present time, both of these factors are discounted. So the guidelines will take you through how you calculate these, what information is required, and will give you the working examples for inputting data into the MRV tool. So accounting is the information that is provided for carbon tax payments, as opposed to reporting, which is all of your emissions that are reported to the Department of Environment. So the mills have been used to working around reporting and accounting of their emissions. And in the guideline document, you will see the boundaries that are allowed for a mill. This shows a pulp and paper mill, but could equally be the same for the sawmill. And you see that the boundary is carbon coming in and the fractions of carbon that are leaving. So we have gaseous carbon emissions, carbon leaving in the products, and carbon that leaves from waste and in liquid effluent. And it's based on a mass balance. And the factors that are used to calculate these different points have been calculated for the sector through a master's research program that was sponsored by PAMSA, and these factors are included in the guideline document. But any mill that has calculated their own values, then these can also be motivated and used. But there are some rules around this methodology also. Any recycled paper that comes in, or pulp or products, have to be excluded because they've already been included in the previous pass through the mill. And also at this product stage, a factor is applied for decay factors. So we pay in advance for the emissions that are emitted from decay of the products in landfill sites. And that information is also all the factors are included in the guideline document. And you can see that the guideline document does allow for third-party timber coming in. And the MRV tool does allow for reporting of those emissions. But one of the reasons that we are speaking today is that government had an issue of including the third-party timber into accounting emissions, so to be able to be credited from the carbon tax payment. And in the Taxation Laws Amendment Act of 2022, they define sequestration as storing GHG forestry plantations and harvested wood products within the operational control of the taxpayer. And a third-party timber was excluded because they feel that there are administrative challenges in monitoring and verifying activities, mainly as a reason because most of the plantations that are third-party timber are not registered at the present time. There's a potential for double counting, so you're counting carbon at the plantation and at the mill, and abuse. So they felt that they were not comfortable to include that at this time because of these potential problems. But we felt that this was possible to mitigate, and we therefore implemented the pilot project with SAFAS and with support from the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment to see if we could develop a methodology and a way of registering, reporting, verifying emissions at the plantations so that government could feel comfortable in including third-party timber in the mill mass balance calculations for carbon tax. So the next presentation will go into a lot more detail around the objective of that pilot project and also around reporting of emissions at the plantation level. So I'll leave it there and allow David to discuss a little more detail around that protocol.
Good morning, all. I must say, when we're coming from forestry and looking at all this carbon stuff, I was pretty daunted in the beginning. Probably extremely daunted. Anyway, what we're going to present here is a project and a protocol that we carried out together with the department and with PAMSA to try and make carbon reporting a lot more simple, a lot easier and straightforward for growers, for forestry plantation owners, and yet overcome some of the challenges that are prevalent in reporting. So I'm going to, in my presentation now, I'm going to cover how one calculates the total carbon stock on a plantation, and what goes into the calculations and all these things, but hopefully make it much more simple than it sounds. Then talk a little bit about the need for reporting and accounting, and then I'll go into detail about the SAFAS protocol, how we hope that it will meet the problems that have been identified by Treasury, and then talk a bit about operational control and hopefully in that demystify and make this whole thing less daunting. So, calculating carbon stock and greenhouse gas emissions. On a plantation, the first step one's got to do is calculate the total carbon stock that you have up on your plantation. And this picture here kind of shows what we would regard as a plantation in rotation. So that you'd have harvested compartments, you'd have mature compartments, and you'd have trees at different ages, and you'd have some newly planted compartments. Now, the first thing one does is calculate the total utilizable timber. We call that standing tons or standing stock, and that's the timber, the wood that you would harvest, the growing wood that would be harvested and sold. And plantation owners, but you know, that's kind of a standard process for them. Everybody knows what their standing stock are, and calculate or estimate how much timber they have on their plantation. But you've got to add the rest of the tree, the leaves, the branches, and the roots in. And there are factors that one can use. We have tier 2, and remember that tier 1 factors are international factors, estimations based on calculations of how many leaves and branches and roots trees have based from international data. Tier 2 level data is national data, and tier 3 data would be if you've actually measured it on your plantation. So we would then add on the rest of the trees using mostly tier 2 data from this country. We have that data. And then litter layer, harvest residues in the harvested compartments need to be added. And again, that is tier 2 data. And then soil stored carbon that is in soil. This is mostly tier 1 and some tier 2 data. So adding your utilizable carbon, your utilizable timber, your rest of the tree, and all this makes up how much biomass or how much carbon there is on your plantation in the biomass. So that's the first step, and it's not particularly difficult. The next step, though, is to calculate the carbon balance by accounting for the harvested timber. And the harvested timber is the carbon stored in the timber that is sold to the mill. And this is not included into the carbon stock. So this goes off, and as Julie said, it goes off into the mill and it is accounted for in the mill. And the carbon that then gets processed and gets stored in the final products, that's the carbon that is sequestrated. And so there's no double accounting from the plantation point of view, that this timber and the carbon in this timber does not get accounted in the plantation. So it can be counted as an emission, really. You then have to look at emissions if in the harvested compartments, the compartments are burnt. So many foresters, many forestry organizations burn their residue so they have access and can go and replant. The emissions from that is calculated. The emissions from decomposing litter and harvest residue is calculated for using standard tier 2 or standard tier 1 factors. We also have to account if there's any wildfires. So, and what we mean by wildfires is if any of the plantation, your growing stock, was burnt, those emissions are accounted for. One has to measure how much of your plantation was burnt and calculate the loss of carbon. If on planting new compartments, fertilizer was used, the emissions from fertilizer needs to be accounted for or calculated and reported, as does any emissions from fuel use for any forestry activities. So once you've got your carbon stock, you subtract the emissions and you get the carbon balance for a plantation, and that's done on an annual basis. So carbon stored in biomass, litter, and soil minus the emissions gives you your carbon balance. Now, if you want to know how much carbon you've sequestrated or lost, you look at the carbon stock difference. And I know Suella mentioned that there's two methods, but the carbon stock difference method means that you compare your current carbon balance with the carbon balance from the previous year, and that will give the carbon stock difference. So if your carbon balance for year 2 or the current year is greater than your carbon balance for the previous year, then you are carbon positive. You've had some sequestration. If it's the same, then you're carbon neutral. And if this year you have less carbon stored on your plantation than you had last year, you would be carbon negative. Now, it stands to reason that some years plantations will be carbon positive, some years they should be neutral, and some years negative. So in good years after good years of rainfall, extra growth, you could well have more carbon on your plantation. But in drought years and in years where you might have a big fire or you might have a loss due to pests or diseases, you could be carbon negative. And this is well understood, so that, you know, it's not expected that every year you will be carbon positive. Some years you might be carbon negative. But by measuring and understanding what is causing these, one can then start managing to try and increase the amount of carbon you do store on the plantation and decrease the emissions, so to improve the carbon situation. So that really is a quick overview of what's involved when calculating carbon and reporting carbon stock and carbon or greenhouse gas emissions on the plantation. Suella very thoroughly went into all the reasons why one should report, and Julie also covered why accounting is important from a mill point of view. But just to recap, it's really important to recognize, or it is recognized, that forests and plantations do sequester and store carbon. And it's really important for the country that plantations and forests continue to be carbon storage facilities, carbon sinks, or and so if we're going to understand this, one obviously has to measure how much carbon is stored on plantations and then report on these. And the regulations require all plantations equal to and above 100 hectares to report sequestration and emissions. But as Julie pointed out, timber mills pay a carbon tax on annual greenhouse gas emissions and are permitted to offset the carbon sequestered in their harvested wood products, but only if that's for first-party timber plantations. And so if you are supplying to a timber mill or to a pulp mill, and you are not under the operational control of that mill, that your carbon in your harvested wood products is unable to be offset against this tax. And Julie covered those reasons, the administrative problems, you know, from reporting and verifying third-party activities, the potential for double accounting, the potential for the abuse of accounting requirements, and really the lack of operational control. But as PAMSA recognizes, and that's a significant proportion of mill intake is from third parties, and it's really important that this contribution to carbon sequestration is recognized, and hopefully it's able to be used or accounted for by the mill. And also from a SAFAS and a forestry point of view, we really don't want to see the potential of small growers being disadvantaged if a mill or an organization is not able to offset the carbon that its intake from certain producers. They might not want to, and it might encourage only first party intake. So we want to level the playing fields and account for all carbon tax, and that is why this protocol was developed. So SAFAS, along with PAMSA and with the participation of DEFI, developed a protocol to try and overcome these problems and to enable third-party timber to be accounted for, but also help forestry organization, plantation owners, and especially the smaller plantation owners to report their carbon and register and report on against the requirements. So the protocol was developed first to try and simplify greenhouse gas emission calculations, and we did this by using what we call the value-based platform, which is a tool that really does simplify the calculations. We'll go through it, but it really kind of does all the calculations for the grower. It facilitates verification of these emissions because the data is collected, it's stored in the right place, and it makes it very easy through plantation visits, through understanding what has been reported to make sure that the requirements or the verification that the data is correct and has been reported correctly. The platform and the protocol also assesses plantation sustainability, and we'll go into a little bit of detail, which is one of the requirements for operational control, and it's a very important requirement for reporting and storing carbon. One of the big issues is if there's deforestation, well, then you're losing your carbon storage facility as a nation, and that is a real issue that we don't want to happen. It also provides assurance of chain of custody, so making sure that we know that timber leaving a plantation is the same timber arriving in a mill, and that needs to be accounted for. And then it can facilitate the registration of growers on SAGEs and report on their behalf. So hopefully helping with some of the daunting requirements of SAGEs and MRV tool and all those issues. And it also demonstrates that by contracting with the mill to follow the protocol, mill requirements for counting and reporting and for sustainability are met. So we hope and agree that using this protocol will provide adequate operational control. And then hopefully that Treasury will then allow for third-party timber to be accounted for. So the protocol is designed to have 5 quite straightforward steps. Step 1, the grower registers on the value-based platform, provides data, and I'll show you which data, and completes a risk survey. Step 2, the value-based platform then calculates sequestered carbon, it calculates greenhouse gas emissions, and conducts the sustainability risk assessment. Step 3 is a verification of the calculations and sustainability status, and it also verifies chain of custody. Once that's all done, step 4, the grower will receive a report and a certificate and signs off that he's provided the right information. He believes that the information that the value-based platform calculates is correct. And then step 5, the VBP will transfer the carbon data onto SAGEs, and reporting then is complete. So it sounds a lot more simple and hopefully straightforward. But let's have a look. Now, this is a little bit of a daunting slide, but it's just a bit of background on what the value-based platform is, and I'm not going to go into detail, but basically it is an online assessment tool where when registering on it, one can undertake an assessment of the plantation. You answer some simple, straightforward questions, provide some data, and a risk assessment is completed. There's a carbon module where the plantation owner will then provide some compartment data, answer a few questions on carbon issues, and the carbon calculations will be done. Also on the platform is a whole lot of supporting information, best practices, the standards, requirements for certification, requirements for sustainable forest management, and so on. So it's a straightforward platform which actually was designed to help with certification, help with sustainable management, and it's a management tool to meet the requirements of the National Sustainable Forest Management System, really. So just going into a little bit of detail, step one of the protocol, once the grower has registered on the VBP, they provide compartment data, and the compartment data is actually quite simple. For each compartment, what the VBP would require is the area of the compartment, the species that is planted in that compartment, the date planted, and an MAI, mean annual increment, if you have that accurate MAI. Having your own MAI means that's tier 3 data. It's your own data. If that's not supplied, we can have tier 2 data, which should be averaged for that species in that kind of site quality and so on. So that's straightforward data that's provided. Most plantation owners will have this data. We would then also ask annually if any compartments have been damaged by fire or lost to fire, which compartments are harvested, which compartments, if they were harvested, the residue was burnt, and where the fertilizer was used on planting. And then additional to that is if the grower has the amount of fertilizer and the type of fertilizer they used, that would be tier 3 data. If they don't have that, some mixed farmers might not have exact fertilizer information for each compartment, but we can then use tier 2 data, which is averages for the country and what is normally used, and then also the amount of petrol and diesel they used in forest activities. Again, tier 3 data is if farmers have accurate data, we can use tier 2 data, which is averages for harvesting or for planting or for silvicultural activities. So this kind of data is normally quite easy to ascertain. The grower also completes a risk survey, and once that is done, it will indicate to the grower how well they comply with the National Sustainable Forest Management Standards. And there too, there's the PFC or the SAFAS developed standard for, and that's the national standard, homegrown standard for sustainable forest management, and one can get PFC certification through that standard, or there's the FSC standard, which is also a national standard now, the national FSC standard, and the value-based platform can indicate how well you comply with either or both of those standards. Step 2, the protocol, the VBP calculates the carbon stocks and greenhouse gas emissions from the information that's supplied, and it gives kind of totals as shown on the screen here, what your total carbon standing CO2 equivalents would be. So that it does all the conversions that are required before reporting, and that go into the MRV tool as well. Carbon balance, carbon harvested in wood products, that is shown, and obviously that is not calculated into the standing stock of the plantation, carbon emissions and so on. So you get a full picture of exactly what the carbon situation is for the plantation, what your carbon stocks are and what your emissions are. And during the pilot project, we did this for a whole number of farms, and this is some of the information that came out. Interestingly, that none of the farms that we used in the pilot project had wildfires. None of them used fertilizer, but we were able to show all the other figures, and this illustrates that the protocol and the procedures worked quite well, quite straightforward, and it was not too difficult to do the calculations. The protocol also requires some sort of verification. So step 3 of the protocol, it's easy once you've got the information to check whether the data is reported correctly. So one can go and have a look, and you say, oh, well, you've got this compartment, you reported it's this species, it's say 3 years old, and in the picture there you can see that one can go and check. You can check whether operational control or the plantation is managed properly, fire breaks are being built, it's been protected. One can look at social issues, whether it's how you managing local communities or your housing. Health and safety and workers' rights are checked, biodiversity management, and all the sustainability requirements of the standards can be checked and are verified by the protocol. So it's quite a straightforward process, and one has a certain amount of confidence that one can then report these figures. Step 4 is the grower will receive a report, a simple report, a 2-page report with a certificate with his carbon calculations, and here's an example of a grower of what would be in the certificate, comparing 2021 with 2022 and the figures that come out. The grower would then sign off, say this is correct, he's happy with it, and that would then give SAFAS the authority to transfer the results, these figures, onto SAGES, and that is then step 5. That transfer, on receiving the sign-off, reporting takes place. Now, should external verification be required, which often is, and as Suella pointed out, there will be a certain amount of requirement for external accredited verifiers to come and verify that the information is correct. The VBP makes that process quite easy because it has a record of everything that was reported, and it can pull out, show where the risks are, show what was reported, and makes the whole process quite straightforward. I just need to point out that the transfer process from the protocol onto SAGES has not been formalized and tested yet. We're still working with DEFI to get this into place. Obviously, it's as one saw that it's quite an involved process, and we were unable to do it because we haven't formally got any data to report yet. But this hopefully will be in place in the coming months. And if it's not in place, one can always report the figures manually until it gets into place. So that's basically what the protocol involves. It's quite straightforward and hopefully much more simple for growers to calculate their carbon and report their carbon. A little bit on operational control. Now, operational control is a requirement by the mill that the grower reports their carbon, so calculates and reports their carbon. The grower has a proper chain of custody, and that the grower is sustainable, and so kind of meets the national forest, sustainable forest requirements. So basically, they need to accurately record all sales and the information around their sales. So SAFAS can provide a chain of custody system and a system for recording sales, so that timber is clearly reported and tracked to each market. It also shows how the plantation complies with the Sustainable Forest Management Standards. And we here use the national, the SAFAS standard, which is the PFC certification standard. It also shows if the grower has a contract with the mill to follow the protocol, they are agreeing to measure and report their carbon stocks. And then it also says that they allowed third-party verification of reporting and sustainability to take place. And these steps and following the protocol should then be sufficient to meet operational control if there is a contract between the mill and the grower to do this. So that's how we see operational control being taken care of. And then if this is accepted, third-party timber will be allowed to be accounted for. So in conclusion, carbon stocks and greenhouse gas emissions can be calculated using the value-based platform carbon module, and it simplifies this reporting, especially for small growers. It can be daunting with all these terminology and everything. So hopefully it makes things a lot easier for small growers. Verifying the accuracy of data is made easy as well using the protocol. The protocol also clearly and transparently shows how sustainability requirements are met. And then it supplies a chain of custody and can be certified, the chain of custody. So timber is tracked very clearly from plantation to mill. And it covers the requirements of reporting and accounting and sustainability, so that operational control is met. And hopefully, and we're very confident that it will also automatically transfer the values onto SAGES. So reporting is taking place, and reporting for plantations of above 100 hectares or equal to and above 100 hectares is a regulated requirement. So it is the law, and it will be in certification standards and all sorts. So it's there, and it has to happen. And that's basically a very quick overview of the protocol. I know that I went through it very quickly, and hopefully there's enough for you to now ask questions, hopefully pique your interest and get involved. Thanks, Sam.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, someone has commented that you had an excellent presentation. They do. Abraham Dupree asks, can all non-commercial indigenous forests on the forestry estate be included in the calculation of sequestration to offset carbon emissions? Can one of our panelists answer that? So it is in the chat. So can all non-commercial indigenous forests be included in the calculation of sequestration?
I can perhaps answer that question. It can be. It's not part of the protocol. So one would I know there are the tier 1 level basic information that one can use to calculate carbon stored in non-indigenous or in indigenous or native forests, but those are very kind of different calculations that would be required, and it would be you'd be using tier 1 level data. So it can be done, but it's not at this stage a requirement from a plantation point of view. So we don't have to report on carbon in grasslands or other vegetation types.
Thank you. We have a question from Joy Crane around the cost of what is the cost of reporting and the cost of the accounting and reporting process to the mill and the tree grower. Is anybody from the panel able to answer that one? Julie or team?
The cost, it's a very difficult question. So, I'm not sure whether it's just a basic cost, whether as a grower, to do your own reporting, the cost is probably not that great, but I mean, it's quite complicated. But if you join, say, the SAFAS protocol, there will be a cost. It depends on how big and what kind of information is required, but it's not intended to be very high. I can't speak for the mills. I know that actually, for big organizations to report carbon, it's complicated and it is costly. To have the expertise, you've got to have people who know what's going on. You've got to do the measurements. So it can be very costly. But we can't answer the question. We can't say it's R3 per hectare at this stage. But hopefully, through using a simplified protocol or making it easier, the cost shouldn't be too high. But there will be a cost.
Great, thank you. And then we have, I don't see any other questions in the chat that I have missed. I think we've covered most of them. As we've mentioned, this is an overview, and the plan will be to have future webinars that will cover some of the topics in a little bit more detail. I see there's 2 more questions coming in. Judy, this one's for you, or Julie, this one's for you. You mentioned that recycled paper mill is not included, but we report on fuel combustion activity. Can you address it? It's from Pierre Barnes in the chat.
Yes. Fuel combustion is an activity on its own for emissions. Where recycled paper is not included is when you're calculating sequestration or storage of carbon using the mass balance approach with carbon. So the only carbon inputs that are recognized would be first party or third party timber, hopefully in the long term, because it's paper that's recycled has already been credited for that carbon. So we would be counting it twice if carbon recycled material goes in. So you're right for emissions, but it can't be included at this stage. It can't be included for sequestration calculations.
Thanks, Julie.
Hope that covers that.
Hopefully that does. And then from Marisha, how does the carbon tax incentivize sustainable forest management practices? Can you provide examples of such practices? David, I think this might be a little bit more up your alley, but largely South Africa does operate on a sustainable forest management approach to a large degree, but perhaps you can give a little bit more insight into this question.
Well, I don't want to be too technical. So carbon tax only the mills pay, and you know, so they hopefully will incentivize, and the idea is to take in sustainably produced timber. So if it's not sustainably produced, and that's one of the reasons why third-party timber is not accounted for, because there was no assurance that it was sustainably produced. So having a tax there will hopefully incentivize mills to only take sustainably produced timber, and therefore it kind of helps the whole sustainability issue to be improved on the land. You know, reporting, though, the incentives come if you start reporting and understanding where your carbon is going, and you can reduce your carbon emissions so that you become more carbon positive. You know, there's incentives there too. So yeah, the tax from the mill side, but on plantation sides they don't pay tax, or certainly not in this reporting cycle. We don't know in the future whether they will, but at this stage it's actually via the producer.
Thank you, Dave.
So-
Yeah, so Roger, oh, sorry, Julie, you want to add that?
Yes, I'd just like to add on to that from the mill side. The sequestration guidelines do not allow you to count carbon from any timber that's from deforested areas. So unless it's sustainably managed and there's replanting to maintain the carbon pool, it can't be included in that calculation.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it leads to the point around the difference between sustainable forestry and deforestation. And deforestation is simply the removal of trees without replanting. And our sector, I know, is very much on the sustainable side of things and ensuring that we regrow or replant the trees we harvest. And Roger says, yeah, certified timber is advantageous for the mills. We've got 2 other polls going, so before you log off, please participate them around how informative this webinar has been and which topics you'd like to see going forward. And then while you're doing that, perhaps I could just ask Julie or Jane just to wrap up and sort of give us a way forward from here.
I thought that maybe Julie was going to do it, but Jules, you can add. Thank you so much, everybody, for attending. I think from our perspective, the way forward for us is to discover which areas you would like to hear more about. So do you want to know more about the calculations behind the MRV tool? That I think it's a 145-page guidance document. Are you interested in doing all the calculations yourselves, or are you interested in hearing more about the value-based platform and how you can utilize that? Which areas are you keen to hear more about? And then we would look at some dates in August to have further webinars. So from our perspective, that's the way forward. And then Julie, I don't know if you would like to give us some input as well. This webinar has largely been Julie's brainchild, and she's worked very hard to ensure that we have everybody's participation. So Jules, I'll hand over to you now.
We would just like to thank everyone who participated, and we're very keen for feedback from you. So this isn't the end. You can also contact us through the PAMSA website and send through any comments, questions that you would like, and we will put together a program of areas where we need to go into more detail to give you the working documents that you can then take forward and decide on how you're going to comply with the regulations. So what we're saying is we would welcome any input from you along the value chain so that we can work together to motivate for third-party timber to be included and be recognized in the carbon tax. And so thanks very much. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you to Dave, to Jane, to Sewela and her team for their input. There are some other questions. There was one here, but Joy, what we'll do is we can email you an answer around the support for informal mills, if we can do that to you, and then. I see Mivan has said would appreciate more details and discussion around operation control definitions, the tool use, and a general discussion around carbon taxation, accounting, and the process. So yes, we will take all of this feedback into account, no pun intended, and we will then make sure that we are pulling together webinars that address the issues that concern you and hopefully give you more information around them and making the process as smooth and easy as possible. In my opinion, tax is never easy in any respect. So let's hopefully we can help you along the process. So with that, I'd like to just thank you for your attendance. We will have this recording available with a few edits, and the presentations will also be made available obviously through the recording, and with the permission of the speakers, I can also send out the presentations to those people who have attended. So thank you very much and have a good day, and wherever you are, keep warm.